Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. And I will join in the chorus of congratulations to my honourable friend for bringing this bill forward. I would also completely agree with my honourable friend from Kettering's comments that I don't think this is necessarily premature. I prefer the adjectives forward-thinking and far-sighted, if I can put it that way, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the reason why is he's absolutely right to observe that this is a manifesto commitment in the recent general election. And I think, therefore, he is absolutely headed in a direction which we would wholeheartedly endorse. I'm going to take issue with the details of how he proposes to get there. I think I would have some concerns about the practicalities, but in terms of the principle he's trying to get to, and indeed the need for not dilly-dallying, shilly-shallying, or in general not according it a good and high priority, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we are absolutely on the same page, and I would want to reassure him that there is a great deal of work going on actually at the moment. I can tell my honourable friend that there are parliamentary draftsmen even now beavering away at high speed on something which has all sorts of different possible working titles, including overseas electors, overseas voters, all sorts of other possibilities. But we are definitely not hanging around on this. We are moving forward. But as he will appreciate, and he will perhaps be more aware of this than most others, having brought this private member's bill forward himself, there are many important details that need to be got right in order to enfranchise this important group. And my honourable friend from Kettering is quite right to observe that this is potentially a tremendously important extension of our franchise in order to extend democratic rights to people who, in many cases, people would have observed or would have expected should have it. And I was, in fact, I was delighted, I should say, Mr Deputy Speaker, right up front to hear that the Labour Party are very happy to at least consider the question of whether or not the 15-year rule should be set at 15 years. They've got no objection to reviewing that. He's absolutely right, for one spec, to observe that other countries draw that time limit at different points. And in fact, our own country has drawn it at different dates in the past itself. So there isn't necessarily a right or wrong moment. And 15 years is quite an arbitrary number. So I'm encouraged by the fact he's willing to participate in a review in a constructive way. Give way to
Can I thank my honourable friend for his comments and for saying that this bench wishes to actually bring this forward. But can I ask what timetable he is looking for then to actually produce legislation potentially which might support much of what our honourable friend also has put forward?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid I must fall back on the time-worn parliamentary phrase of in due course, rather than being able to give him a firm date at this point. But I can assure him that there is work going on right now in getting this, and we are not hanging around. I will have to leave it at that at this point, but I hope to be able to provide greater clarity in due course.
I enjoyed the Minister's speech hugely, and I'm encouraged by what he's said so far. Would he do the House a service by placing into context this 15-year limit? We haven't yet heard today where this 15-year rule has come from, who imposed it and why, though I think there is a growing consensus that it needs to be abolished.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, the 15-year rule, as I think the honourable member for Wansbeck acknowledged and mentioned in his remarks, is a bit of a hybrid. It has been as low as 5 years, it has been higher as 20 years, I think, in the past. And successive governments have either extended it or narrowed it over time. Rather than sort of trying to be too specific about the history, I think that perhaps the point behind my honourable friend from Kettering's observation is that because it has moved around several times in the past under successive governments, that it is essentially, if you're going to draw a line about the length of time you've been away, it is inherently rather an arbitrary moment to choose any particular point. The reason why the government's manifesto commitment was to enfranchise all British citizens, no matter how long they've been abroad, was that we think that choosing 15 as opposed to 14 or 16 years is inherently like sticking a dart in a dartboard. You really need to say, either if you are a British citizen and you maintain your British citizenship, then at that point that brings with it some rights, some obligations as well, and some connection with this country, and that therefore that's something which should endure. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged by the Labour Party's view on this. I welcome the fact that they are willing to embark on a review of the 15-year rule. I'm also, I would also like to welcome the honourable gentleman's comments about the need for a cross-party approach to driving up registration amongst all underrepresented groups, no matter where they may live, whether or not they are residents in the UK or abroad. And he's absolutely right to point out that there are a succession of groups who are less represented and less registered than others. So his colleague wrote to me recently about students. They are one of the less well represented groups. Some BME communities are less well represented. Expatriates, in fact, are the worst of all. If you look at the percentage of rates of registration, down at about 5%, as we've heard from the speeches earlier on. So they are probably the least well represented of all the underrepresented groups. But I think I would come back to the point made by my honourable friend from Christchurch, and others, actually, to be fair, around this debate so far, which is that we cannot, and we would all, as politicians or Democrats, be diminished if we did, proceed on the basis purely of narrow party political advantages. It is far better, as the Honourable Gentleman from Wandsbeck observed, to proceed on the basis of this is right for democracy if we do it on a cross-party basis without working out which particular groups might be more likely to favour his party or more likely to favour mine, but actually we drive all of us at all of them. Then I think that we improve our democratic credentials and we reduce voter cynicism very dramatically if we approach it on that basis. And perhaps that cynicism is one of the more corrosive influences, not just in reducing some levels of voter registration, but also some levels of voter turnout. You can have people who are registered who then don't choose to exercise their vote. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we will all be familiar with that. And that cynicism about politics, about the political process and about politicians is a key driver of it. And I would just observe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that one of the things which we are trying to do in improving both the registration process and also the reasons for encouraging people to register is to make it both more convenient, simpler, easier, perhaps cheaper and more efficient to register. That is, in fact, trying to deal with what we're calling the plumbing of registration, to improve to make it just less of a hassle to get registered. But it isn't just. I happily give way.
Grateful to him for giving way, but will he confirm to the House that he's not looking at the possibility of introducing an Australian type requirement that people have to vote?
I'm happy to confirm that to my right honourable friend. He's absolutely right. That's not been part of our democratic tradition in this country. Of course, it could be decided, it could be introduced after debate. It's not currently something which was in our party's manifesto and is not part of our current plans at all.
To be very generous in giving way. And on this point about registration, a point which I've made many times, but I think has fallen on deaf ears in the coalition government, but hopefully not on the minister's ears today. All of these underrepresented groups, almost all of them, will have some contact at some point. Some will have multiple contacts with government agencies of one sort or another, whether it's to do with benefits or passports or applications for this, applications for that. Why can't we have a simple cross-governmental rule that every time someone comes into contact with a government agency of some sort, they are asked the question, are you on the electoral register? And if the answer is no, this is how you register.
Speaker, my honourable friend from Kettering gave a good example in his speech earlier about pensions and saying that the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, will inevitably have a list of people they're paying pensions to, and therefore that should allow, as one very cogent example, an opportunity to provide the kind of nudge that he's talking about. I can confirm, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we have in the past, in fact we still do, trialled a series of links on various different government website pages in order to do roughly what the honourable gentleman is describing, and we are currently investigating whether or not that can be extended either more broadly across more government services. So anytime anybody living abroad or indeed in underrepresented groups domestically as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, came into contact with the British state, can we provide a nudge for them to get registered? And that is something which we're looking at extremely carefully because it looks like it is a potentially very sensible way of proceeding. It may not be the whole answer. In some cases, it may not be a very effective answer. In others, it may be highly effective. But it's certainly something which we want to pursue. And I would also add, Mr. I will, and then I must make some progress on that.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving me again and being very generous with his time. As he may know, I represent a naval garrison city with a large military input into it. How can we ensure that we can make sure that more military are actually registered? Because that is something which I have to say I have found very disappointing, in my opinion.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the registration arrangements for service personnel and for Crown servants are, there are some special arrangements already in place for such people, and there are special registration systems which allow them to register in a slightly different way, I hope a more convenient way than other expatriates living in other parts of the world. What we have encountered, though, in the past, both for service personnel, Crown servants, but also for other expatriates, is a problem of if you are living abroad for whatever reason and you are registered to vote and you've also enrolled for a postal vote, which you will need to do as well, those two processes are not necessarily as linked up as they might be. So you may be registered to vote but not have automatically registered for a postal vote even though you thought you were. And then in the past, sometimes the postal vote forms have arrived too late, depending on where you are in the world and how efficient the post was. And so what we've tried to do more recently is to change the guidelines in conjunction with the Electoral Commission to make sure that postal vote forms are sent out earlier with sufficient postage on them, etc., and that the overseas postal vote forms can in future be sent out amongst the earliest batches in each local constituency in order to make sure that the chances of them arriving in time in every part of the world are maximised. And I think all those things will help to drive up both registration rates and also ultimately voting rates as well. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would add that it isn't just about, as I just called it, the plumbing of registration and voting. Those things are important. We can make, I'm sure, significant improvements in them and therefore both in getting more people who are in under-registered groups to register and with any luck helping them to vote as well. But it isn't just about plumbing, it's also about poetry, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There are some groups out there who aren't registered not because it is inconvenient or because they haven't got round to it, but because they view the political process with cynicism or with suspicion. And I think that is, again, something where a cross-party approach to try and enthuse people, to try and persuade people, to try and convince people that actually the answer to their cynicism about the way politics and the democratic process works is to get involved, not to avoid the whole process. And I think that is something which, if one party tries to do it on its own, is going to be far less effective than if we can join hands. And indeed, it isn't just up to politicians. I think we need to join hands not just across the political spectrum, but also with civic society groups right the way across the spectrum as well. We're already doing some of those things. Incidentally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Electoral Commission is also trying to work in this fashion as well. But again, I welcome the Labour Party's offer of a cross-party approach to that, and I would absolutely and dearly like to pursue that with them if I can. I've already mentioned this to the Honourable Gentleman's colleague on the front bench. I'm not here with us today, but she and I have had conversations in the past, and I think that is absolutely the right way to go. If I can, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would also observe that the Electoral Commission understands the importance of not just the plumbing but the poetry, if I can use that analogy. For example, they announced in the course of the last week a collaboration with the writers of Hollyoaks. I understand that, I hope I'm not acting as some terrible plot spoiler here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I understand that they're intending, with the writers of Hollyoaks, to try and blend through the storyline of that soap some kind of encouragement and information about why it's important to register, how to register, and so on and so forth, which I hope we would all support.
Does my honourable friend also, thank you once again for allowing for an intervention, but does my honourable friend also recognise that the Archers has a significantly big process to play in the whole of this, not just in Hollyoaks, because that is a very good soap opera, and wouldn't that be wonderful if they were to actually start talking about people abroad?
I think it's time I joined in to say we're not going to go around the soaps, whatever we're going to do. And the other thing is, I think we are talking about overseas registration, not about the plots about registration in the UK. Mr. Penrose.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Although I would observe, of course, that many of these soaps are also watched by overseas voters, expatriates living abroad. But I take it. I shall move on before I try your patience any further. What I would also, the honourable gentleman's, my honourable friend's bill also talks about internet voting, and this is potentially a very important area. It is interesting, isn't it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we are increasingly, all of us, taking for granted in our lives the use of the internet for more and more things. If you'd mentioned 10 years ago that a large proportion of us, if not a majority yet, would be using internet banking or internet shopping, people would have been very surprised. Yet here we are, and it is increasingly, in this country, a part of normal life. And so I think that if it isn't already happening, some people are already asking the question, as my honourable friend from Christchurch has already asked the question. But if it isn't already happening, then it will certainly start to happen in due course, that people will ask the question, well, why can't we vote online as well? And in fact, the trade union movement has been asking it, and a number of other organisations out there already are starting to use internet voting for some issues. However, my honourable friend from Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport rightly raised the question, and in fact my honourable friend from Christchurch has built this into clause 3 of his bill, that there is a fraud issue. There is a very important issue here about trying to make sure that that fraud can be prevented. And the difficulty is that while we are increasingly used to having online banking, online shopping and those sorts of things, in those cases, if something goes wrong, then broadly speaking, usually our bank or our credit card company or our debit card company or whoever it may be will stand behind the transaction and take the risk away from the consumer. That is perfectly acceptable for commercial transactions. The difficulty, of course, is that when you are talking about a vote, it's extremely hard to work out whether or not a vote has been intercepted and potentially subverted, switched from a vote for the Labour Party to a vote for the Conservative Party, or from an aye or a no in a referendum. It's extremely hard to do that when you have a secret ballot, and of course secret ballots are an essential part of our democracy, and at the same time the stakes could not be higher. Clearly, stealing the government of a country is an incredibly serious issue, and one which it would be extremely hard to unpick afterwards in the way that you can unpick a faulty commercial transaction and make good the money and undertake some sort of a forensic analysis. So I'm not saying that this is not something which I think everyone will expect to happen in due course, but I do believe that the fraud issues are not yet resolved. I'm sure that the technology will continue to advance. I'm sure that technology will at some point be ready, and we will all be able to make sure that we have a robust and transparently solid political process, democratic process, which will allow this to happen. But I don't think that we are yet there. But because of the way that the world is moving, it is happening in more and more areas of our lives. I think it would be a brave man, even one who is not necessarily quite as familiar with Skype as my honourable friend from Christchurch. It would be a brave man to say it would never happen. I suspect it's a question of when, not if, but I'm afraid at the moment at least the answer is not yet. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, I think that I would compliment my honourable friend. On bringing this forward, I would reassure him that we are working extremely hard on this, and that we hope to bring forward a bill which will do many of the things that his bill is proposing in terms of getting rid of the 15-year rule, enfranchising British citizens living abroad, and also, in parallel, separately from this bill, trying to drive up registration amongst underrepresented groups, including expatriates. We will... yes, happily give way. And then I must.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way. He's been very generous. Can he just clarify the remarks he's just made? Is he saying that internet voting is not part of the government's own proposals which are currently being prepared?
I will clarify that, and the answer is it is not currently part, because we do not yet think that the technology is safe enough. What I am saying is that at some point we will keep the technology continuously under review, and at some point there may be a democratic consensus that it has become safe enough, but that moment is not now. So just to conclude my remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, we welcome the intention behind this bill. We remain absolutely committed to the manifesto pledge that we made. We will be introducing our version of this bill, which I hope will be different in technicalities, but absolutely congruent in direction with enfranchising all British citizens, or getting rid of the 15-year rule and therefore enfranchising the missing voters, and in parallel in introducing new measures on a cross-party basis, if at all possible, to find those underrepresented groups, whether they are overseas voters or domestic voters, and to drive up registration wherever we possibly can in future. And with that, therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that my honourable friend will be reassured, will feel able to withdraw this bill for the moment while he waits for our bill to arrive, which I hope will not be for too much longer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend the Minister for his response, and I'm delighted to hear that even as we speak, Parliamentary Council are struggling with the detail of what's to be contained in what I hope would be not just a bill, a government bill, but also government regulations to go with it, so that there wasn't a long gap between the legislation and the regulations. And if I might say to my honourable friend, I think that it's often much better if the draft regulations can be produced at the same time as the bill. And if that was the reason for the delay, then I would be quite prepared to accept that, because I think that it's much easier for the House to consider a bill when they've got the regulations, which are going to be the detailed implementation scheme before them. So having said that, I can understand that it's not been possible to do that yet. I'm disappointed with the use of the expression "in due course," but I can assure my honourable friend that if we haven't made some progress by the time of the next Queen's speech, whenever that might be, I shall seek to resurrect this bill in the next Parliament, in the next session, and to keep the pressure on the government. My honourable friend from Kettering, I'm very grateful to him for his generous remarks. I'm not sure that I agree with his views about extending Clause 1 to local government elections. I think there's quite a complex interaction there, because at the moment European citizens, EU citizens, are able to, who are resident here, are able to participate in local elections, and the trigger is their residence here. And if we started saying that people who are not resident here can participate in local government elections, I think that, and they're not British, I think that would be a significant extension, and I think might have some quite serious implications. And before we knew what we might find, although hopefully this will be sorted out on the 23rd of June, we might find that the European Union was suggesting that their citizens should be able to participate in our general elections. And that, I think, would be completely wrong. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, having said all that, I think that the appropriate thing to do now would be to seek the leave of the House to withdraw this bill for the time being.
So the honourable member seeks leave to withdraw his motion. Is it the pleasure of the House that the motion be withdrawn? Motion withdrawn. I'm